This is the new Patreon series number 21. We're going to be discussing Yeshua's wisdom teachings concerning non-attachment or kihesh and anxiety or diaga. Now, I am not the only person who promotes the views that you hear from me. These views have been developed by many modern scholars, many of them members of the Jesus Seminar. We're going to look at 4 scholars who are members of the Jesus Seminar. Some are living still and some are not, whose views of Yeshua are very similar to mine, that he was not an apocalyptic teacher of eschatological doom, but that he was a teacher of wisdom and could be compared to the wisdom teachers among the Greek philosophers, except in a Jewish modality, as well as being a prophet and an apocalyptic preacher. So let's take a look at some of these people and what they've written and so on in the last 10 or 15 years. First is Robert Funk, who co-founded the Jesus Seminar. He wrote many, many books. The one I would recommend, if you're interested, would be his book called The 5 Gospels. One of the things that the Jesus Seminar understood was that the Gospel of Thomas contained very authentic materials. It was not contained in the canonical Gospels. Many of them followed up on the kind of research that I did through James Robinson and at Claremont and all the other scholars who worked with the Nag Hammadi Coptic Gnostic Library. And many were influenced by a teacher who influenced me very much, Helmut Kester, a great and brilliant German scholar at Harvard Divinity School. Now, Robert Funk was a Protestant, and he had a Bachelor of Divinity master's degree from Butler University and its affiliated Christian Theological Seminary in 1950-51, a PhD from Vanderbilt, and was a Guggenheim Fellow and a senior Fulbright Scholar. He taught at the American School of Oriental Research in Jerusalem and was chairman of the Graduate Department of Religion at Vanderbilt University and executive secretary of the Society of Biblical Literature, and was, of course, founder and first executive director of the Scholars Press. His view was that the historical Jesus was not apocalyptic. Quote, "The views of John the Baptist and Paul are apocalyptically oriented. The early church, aside from Paul, shares Paul's view. The only question is whether the set of texts that represent God's rule as present were obfuscated by the pessimistic apocalyptic notions of Jesus' immediate predecessors, contemporaries, and successors. If Jesus merely adopted the popular views, how did sayings such as Luke 17:20-21 and Luke 11-20 arise? The best explanation is that they originated with Jesus, since they go against the dominant trend of the unfolding tradition. Fellows of the Jesus Seminar are convinced that the subtlety of Jesus' sense of time, the simultaneity of present and future, which is what I've described to you as the way in which prophets talked about the future, was in the past. It was what we call the propheticus perfectus tense, and that subtlety was definitely lost on his followers, many of whom, after all, started as disciples of John the Baptist and are represented in the Gospels as understanding Jesus poorly. So that was his view. John Dominique Crossan was a co-founder of the Jesus Seminar, and he was Catholic. Here's a book by him that you might be interested in, Jesus, a Revolutionary Biography. Now, I don't agree with all the assertions in any of these books, but Crossan was a major scholar in contemporary historical Jesus research, and he and Burton Mack are notable advocates for a non-eschatological view of Jesus, a view that contradicts the more common view that Jesus was an apocalyptic preacher. While contemporary scholars see more value in non-canonical Gospels than past scholars did, Crozon goes farther and further and identifies a few non-canonical Gospels as earlier than and superior to the canonical ones, i.e., the Aramaic core of the Gospel of Thomas and the early Q collection of the sayings of Yeshua. In his view, the historical Jesus was an itinerant whose mode of teaching can be understood on analogy with the cynic sage, that is, the philosophers, the wandering philosophers. Cynic does not mean cynical, but who is nonetheless a Jew who believed that the kingdom, or the Malkuth, was being made available by the God of Israel to his people. By the way, he also pointed out that the second coming is a late corruption of Jesus' message. Stephen Patterson was a Protestant, got his degrees from Harvard and Claremont. He was a Fulbright Fellow in Germany, Professor of New Testament at Eden Seminary in St. Louis, then George H. Atkinson Endowed Chair in Religious and Ethical Studies at Willamette University. He was a leading figure in the Jesus Seminar. He wrote a book called The Fifth Gospel. He's talking about, of course, the Gospel of Thomas, which people had come to recognize was of equal stature when it came to the sayings of Yeshua with anything preserved in the four Gospels. He proposed that, quote, Jesus was a wisdom teacher and that the early Jesus movement thought of itself as a kind of wisdom school. By moving the wisdom mode of discourse in a more speculative direction, one could account on the one hand for the wisdom-oriented opponents of Paul, reprimanded in 1 Corinthians, who some people have defined as, quote, Gnostics, which is a term that doesn't mean much anymore. And on the other, for the emergence of the descending, ascending revealer Christology that comes to predominate later in the Gospel of Thomas and in John. Finally, I'm going to tell you about Burton Mack, who's one of many other scholars who've done excellent work and are contemporary with me. He was primarily a scholar who concentrated on Q, which he called the Lost Gospel. He was a Protestant. He was a John Wesley Professor Emeritus in Early Christianity at Claremont School of Theology in Claremont, California, primarily a scholar of Christian origins. And his view was that traditional Christian documents like the Gospels are essentially mythic, not historical, which is pretty much the view of most decent modern scholars that are not fundamentalists. Jesus was a wandering sage, similar in style to the Greco-Roman cynics, and that the earliest Jesus movements followed a similar model. Well, he's talking about that sociologically, the fact that there were traveling itinerant prophets going from church to church and so on. And that is a model that we find among the itinerant philosophers in the Hellenistic world. But now we're having it in Jewish modality. Well, all of these things are things that I don't necessarily agree totally with, but I want to show you the ways in which, some of the ways in which Yeshua was teaching not just Devarim and Mashalim that were apocalyptic or essentially an extension of the proclamation of John the Baptist, but that he was teaching also in the Jewish wisdom tradition, mostly privately, not so much in public. And I think you'll find this to be very interesting. We have to understand that Yeshua has been understood much more recently by scholars as a person who taught also in the sense of philosophy as a wisdom teacher. We're going to look at the background of these teachings. Many modern scholars are recognizing that a lot of what he transmitted does not fall just under the category of prophecy or of apocalyptic, but it does fall under the category of a whole philosophy of life and living. And that philosophy is not written in a long tome like the writings we have of Epictetus or Plato or whatever, It is preserved in a lot of what you might call dark sayings in terms of Hebrew. These are mashalim and davarim, and certain kinds of sermons about not just ethics and behavior, but about wisdom itself in life. And there's quite a tradition behind all that in Israel. Now, Yeshua taught kihesh, which is non-attachment to wealth or status or power. The concept was developed in Jewish wisdom schools from about at least 200 BC, at least in terms of what we have in the extant writings. It's an Hebrew Aramaic piel form of kahesh, to deny, disavow as false. It's probably a term Yeshua used many times in his teachings about non-attachment. The root meaning is a lie, a falsehood. And that was the concept that you will find in Ecclesiastes, Koheleth, the wisdom teacher, perhaps 150 BC, writing about Hebel, the illusion, the smoke and illusion of life, and the transitoriness of life, and the fact that there are many things that can deceive. Now, significantly, Yeshua was described by his contemporary Jewish writer Josephus not as a prophet, but as a Jewish Hakim, a wise man. Now, Yeshua employed some of the same rhetorical analogies as the contemporary Stoic philosopher Epictetus, who also uniquely contrasted the idea of flesh with spirit, which became a very basic concept in Christianity and Pauline thought and so on. We find it in the Johannine teachings as well. Yeshua's wisdom sayings constitute an important part of his body of teaching, which we have only in fragments and through remembered sayings and stories. But they were probably not part of his public proclamation as erroneously portrayed in the Christian Gospels, where he stands before crowds of people and tells them various kinds of wisdom and so on. They seem to have been taught to disciples and patrons, often during a Shabbat or Sabbath or other meal in private homes. His extant wisdom sayings were a continuation of the philosophy of earlier Jewish wisdom schools. In the 4th to 2nd centuries BC, Jewish wisdom writings like Ecclesiastes or Koheleth the teacher, and the later Wisdom of Jesus ben Sirach, which was composed in Jerusalem, as well as the book of Proverbs, which were all attributed to David and Solomon by the Judahite writers and collectors of the Old Testament who were exiled in Babylon, but which drew upon much more ancient oral and written wisdom traditions of the Middle East, specifically the Edomite traditions. And the Edomites were probably the same people as the early Hebrews, as the stories of Jacob and Esau make clear. They derived from Egyptian and Edomite proverbs and continued the ancient literary genre of a wise elder imparting advice about life to a younger generation. In Ecclesiastes, the repeated admonition that all is Hebel, insubstantial and illusory like vapor. It's very poorly translated as vanity. Vanity, all is vanity. That seems to reflect the influence of Greek philosophy as well. The personification of wisdom as the feminine face of Godhead who tests her disciples before they are rewarded with Malkuth, as found in the writings of Ben Sirach and others, is reflected in Logion 2 of the Gospel of Thomas, which is authentic, and as I have shown, is the prologue to the entire collection of Kabbalistic or Midrashic wisdom sayings in Devarim that constitute the Aramaic core of the Gospel of Thomas. So, wisdom teaching was definitely a very important part of the body of teaching that was transmitted by Yeshua. Now we're going to look at the wisdom sayings of Yeshua. We're going to look at the idea of kichesh or kichesh, detachment from or renunciation of illusion. The Jewish teaching of kichesh, or freedom or detachment from deceit or illusion or non-attachment, is probably derivative from experiences of the ancient Hebrew nomadic period and the 40 years of wandering during the Exodus as remembered and interpreted in the Babylonian captivity. Diaspora and exile has always been a major part of the Jewish experience throughout history and throughout the period before the time the Old Testament was written down and all the way to the present time. The reality that life is uncertain and that people live ultimately in an existential state of nomadic wandering was basic to the ritual of the offering of the first fruits prescribed in Deuteronomy 26. Then the priest shall take the basket from your hand and set it down before the altar of Yahweh your God. You shall answer and say before Yahweh your God, my father was a wandering Aramean, and he went down to Egypt. This was at least the myth or the legend that was constructed partially through remembered traditions and partially through constructed traditions by those who were in the Babylonian exile who constructed and put together what we call the Old Testament. The wisdom schools reminded diaspora Jews that, like the ancient Hebrew nomads, no matter how secure and welcome and settled they might feel, a time would come when Jews would need to be travelers once again in search of a homeland. Now, Yeshua told his disciples that kihesh, or renunciation of or non-attachment to worldly illusions, is the essential condition of his halakha of spiritual rebirth. The only remedy for impermanence is non-attachment to the illusions of material reality. He said, let him who has grown spiritually wealthy be sovereign, and let him who possesses world power renounce it. Worldly power should be renounced. We find in Logian 81 of the Gospel of Thomas. Here the word translated renounce is the Greek loanword arnesthai from the original Hebrew Aramaic piel form of kachash, to deny or disavow as false. So let's take a look at wisdom sayings of Yeshua concerning non-attachment. To understand kihesh, we must begin with the following wisdom davar of Yeshua. Become passers-by. The shortest teaching that we have of the extant teachings of Yeshua, Thomas Logian 42. Become passers-by. The meaning is, just as you practice shachad, release or forgiveness of those who sin against you, also practice kihesh, to release yourself from egoistic attachment to property status and false identity with all that is impermanent. A similar teaching of non-attachment was handed down in Christian thought as transmitted here in this 2nd century epistle from Mathetes to Diognetus, the epistle to Diognetus. They, the Christians, dwell in their own countries but simply as sojourners. As citizens they share in all things with others, and yet endure all things as if foreigners. Every foreign land is to them as their native country, and every land of their birth as a land of strangers. They marry, do as all others, they beget children, but they do not destroy their offspring. They have a common table, but not a common bed. They are in the flesh, but they do not live after the flesh. They pass their days on earth, but they are citizens of heaven. The concept that is widely known among the early Christian teachings, that we are called to be in the world but not of the world, and as modern interpreters have added, yet for the world. Unfortunately, in early Greek-speaking Christianity, the concept was misunderstood as renunciation of personal pleasure, comfort, and life on earth, which was a recipe for asceticism. And asceticism became the measure of sainthood in many of the Eastern and Asian Christian communities. I should also say that Yeshua was criticized for not being extremely ascetic like John the Baptist. He was criticized as a winebibber and a glutton. He taught definitely a middle way. He did not teach a way of asceticism or against marriage or anything like that. But this concept in early Greek-speaking Christianity became dominant and dominated things like the Thomasians that we find in the literature of the Thomas Christians, tremendous anti-marriage, anti-sentiment, anti-childbearing bias. Now, let's take a look at the concept of diaga. Keizer was more than just releasing oneself from emotional attachment to wealth and status. It was also self-release from anxiety, worry, and fear. It was a diaga, release from anxiety and worry and fear. Luke tells a pericope of Mary and Martha, which illustrates one kind of diaga, or fear and worry. When Martha criticizes Mary for laying aside women's kitchen work to hear the teachings of Yeshua, Yeshua says, "Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things, but one thing is needful. Mary has chosen the good portion, which shall not be taken away from her." Worry is recognized in modern psychology as a self-destructive form of neurotic behavior that can lead to obsessive-compulsive disorder. It often substitutes for activities and solutions that could address the causes of worry. In Buddhist teaching, the fourth hindrance to obtaining enlightenment, daha kukaka and kukuka, in Pali, in the Pali language, the fourth hindrance to obtaining enlightenment is often translated restlessness and worry, or sometimes restlessness and remorse or regret. So it's very important to substitute action for worry, and Yeshua strongly advised against entertaining worry and absorbing yourself in it and letting yourself be ruled by this kind of concern. Now, let's take a look at a famous sermon. It's actually from the Sermon on the Lilies of the Valley, as it's normally known, but it's a sermon that probably was not a sermon, it's probably a saying. It was hooked up together and made into a sermon, perhaps an early Christian thought. But it's a saying of Yeshua concerning anxiety, diaga. Do not worry, that is diaga, be anxious, from early until late or from evening to morning. Which of you by worrying can add 1 hour to your span of life? Worry neither for your food, what you will eat, nor for your clothes, what you will wear. Now this appears as a separate saying in several other sources, so we think it probably was not originally connected with the lilies of the valley part. The gospel versions seem to redact this from Q or their oral Jesus traditions and include their own additions and conclusions. The Coptic Thomas does not include the lilies of the valley section, but the earlier Greek Thomas fragments from Oxyrhynchus do. So this common witness is evidence that the whole sermon is probably authentic, although it may not have come down in one piece, or it may not have occurred at the same time. Greek saying 36 in Papyrus Oxyrhynchus, that is one of the few Greek segments we have preserved of the Gospel of Thomas, says, Jesus said, "Do not worry from early until late, nor from evening until morning." That's a good Aramaic idiom. Worry neither for your food, what you will eat, nor for your clothes, what you will wear. You are much greater than the lilies, which neither care nor spin. And when a car that should be should neither card nor spin. When you have no clothing, what do you wear? Who can add to your time of life? He it is who will give you your clothing. In the Coptic version of the Gospel of Thomas, the main version has only Jesus said, "Do not be concerned from morning until evening, from evening until morning about what you will wear." And then he says, "Consider the ravens. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, and yet God feeds them. Are you not worth more than the birds?" This appears in Luke and Matthew with only a few variations, but Matthew transmits birds of the sky, as we find in an authentic saying in Thomas Logian 3, whereas Luke, Papias, and Marcion's Lucan texts in the Evangelion have the ravens. This has parallels in a wisdom teaching of Epictetus, but that is given from a Stoic philosophical perspective of self-sufficiency. He says, "But a man may say, whence shall I get bread to eat when I have nothing? And how do slaves and runaways? On what do they rely when they leave their masters? Do they rely on their lands or slaves or their vessels of silver? They rely on nothing but themselves, and food does not fail them." This, of course, is a Stoic lecture on self-reliance, but the topic is worry about food and clothing. "And it should be necessary for one among us who is a philosopher to travel into foreign parts, and should it be necessary for one of us who is a philosopher to travel into foreign parts and trust to and rely on others, and not to take care of himself, and shall he be inferior to irrational animals and more cowardly, each of which, being self-sufficient, neither fails to get its proper food nor to find a suitable way of living, and one conformable to nature?" So this is, as I say, it was an issue that we find in the Greek and other wisdom traditions, and Yeshua is speaking to that issue. Now, this is connected with another important saying concerning, we call it the Sermon on the Lilies of the Valley. He says, "Consider the lilies of the valley." Now, the lilies of the valley, by the way, is a reference to the marriage of Messiah in Midrashic interpretation from the mystical interpretation of the Song of Solomon or Song of Psalms, 2nd chapter, 1st verse. So, it's a teaching about messianic fulfillment in the mouth of Yeshua. "Consider the lilies of the valley. You are much greater than the lilies, which neither card nor spin. Amen, I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not attired more splendidly than one of these." And Solomon was, in legend, supposed to be dressed in the finest of silks and other kinds of things. "But if God so clothes the grass in the field, which is alive today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, how much more does he," and I'm translating it from Aramaic, which does not have a future tense, but it means how much more will he clothe you, little ones. When you have no earthly clothing, that is, when your body dies and you become a spirit, what do you, that is, will you, wear? It's a rhetorical question, typical rabbinic way of putting out a provocative question. The rabbinic answer would be, you will wear the robe of glory. And what is the robe of glory? Well, we need to discuss that. It is, or will be, the Abba who gives you your true clothing, by which he's referring to the robe of glory. "And do not worry, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or what shall we wear? For it is the Gentiles who strive for all these things, and your Abba knows that you need them. But instead, seek the Malkuth, that is, the the kingdom or the sovereignty, and all these things are, meaning will be, provided for you as well. And that we have from Q, which is quoted in Matthew and Luke. We have from Greek Thomas Logian 36, and from Papias, well attested as an authentic saying. The meaning is something like this: do not engage in fruitless worry. Worry doesn't do any good to anybody. If you keep your soul in attunement with God, that is, seeking the Malkuth first, your basic needs for food and clothing will always be met. But your true clothing is the royal robe of glory that you construct with the merit you create in earthly life. You will receive it from the Abba when you become worthy of the Kima. If you make the divine Malkuth your first priority, all needs will be provided for you, and after death you'll be clothed in your glorious royal robe. Now let me explain this messianic saying about messianic fulfillment. What was the robe of glory? Well, when Yeshua said, if God so clothed the grass in the field, meaning the lilies of the valley, how much more will he clothe you? He referred to the Kabbalistic robe of righteousness, multifaceted and multicolored, of which Joseph's coat of many colors was an allegory. It was interpreted as the reward of the righteous in the heavens. The concept first appeared in the Babylonian Trito Isaiah 61:10. I will greatly rejoice in Yahweh. My soul shall be joyful in my God. For he hath clothed me with the garments of salvation. He hath covered me with the robe of righteousness, as a bridegroom decketh himself with a garland, and as a bride adorneth herself with her jewels. In messianic interpretation, or midrash, this would become the raiment worn by the tzaddikim, the righteous ones, the perfect of the kima, of the life after death. Paul's spiritual body, his soma pneumatikon, probably represents an early Christian adaptation of this Kabbalistic concept. And these were Kabbalistic antecedents to the Gnostic, multifaceted royal robe of the purified soul that returns to his aeonic home in heaven, or the heavens, after laying aside his outer garments of flesh, that is, dying. The Syrian Gnostic hymn of the pearl is found in the Acts of Thomas. It describes the perfected soul's return to heaven after successfully completing its mission to recover the pearl, or original divine identity that has been lost in the bondage of fleshly incarnation. Like many ideas of the Valentinian and other Gnostics, this derived from Jewish Kabbalistic Haggadah. The reason Greek Thomas, the Gospel of Thomas, preserves the lilies of the valley theme, even though we don't have it in the Coptic version, was that the Syrian Gnostics regarded one's true raiment to be the glorious divine robe of the soul extolled in the beautiful and eloquent Thomasian hymn of the pearl. This idea originated in Jewish mysticism, was part of Yeshua's teachings, as we can see, but was later adapted to Valentinian and Thomasian Gnostic theology. So we're going to take a look at the hymn of the pearl, translated by Mead from the old Syriac text in his book, The Hymn of the Robe of Glory, and you can see that online at this link I've given you. It's from the Acts of Thomas. It's called the Hymn of the Pearl. The person who has descended into the world and has lost himself in the world and has finally started to find himself. He's tamed the dragon, and he's finally finally managed to find the pearl. He's found the goal, because the point of incarnation is not just to get back, it's in order to gain something, it's in order to evolve a higher sense by being tested in the world. Now he's done that, and he's returning now to the heavens, and now as he ascends, the glorious robe, all bespangled with sparkling splendor of colors, with gold and also with beryls and chalcedonies and iris-hued opals perhaps, with sards of varying colors to match its grandeur. Moreover, it had been completed with adamantine jewels. All of its seams were off-fastened. Moreover, the King of Kings image was depicted entirely all over it. The King of Kings image is a Gnostic concept of the that developed from the image of God that is or in the image of the Elohim that is inscribed in the heart of all human beings. And as with sapphires above was it wrought in a motley of color. Sapphires refer to the color of the sea, the sea that is lays before the throne of God, and that is imitated or is reproduced in the what was called the Sapphire Sea, or the huge basin of water in front of the Solomonic temple. I saw that moreover all over it the motions of gnosis abounding. I saw it further was making ready as though for to speak. So here's this robe that has the image of God on it, and it's going to speak. And it has motions of knowledge all over it. It's a very abstract concept, not very much different than the abstract concepts of Ezekiel and Isaiah's visions. I heard the sound of its music, which it whispered as it descended. Behold him, the active in deeds, for whom I was reared with my father. Now, him is the disciple who's died, he's left his body, he's ascending. He's active in deeds, he's done the good works. For whom I was reared with my father, for whom I, the robe, is in a kind of a parallel way, is being grown, as being developed in the heavenly places through the Father. I too have felt in myself how that with his works waxed my stature. In other words, as the disciple triumphed through his works and activities in life, and his seeking in life, and his final achieving of the pearl, the robe itself has felt that it grew and it waxed with spiritual strength as the disciple gained that spiritual strength. So the robe is kind of a twin of oneself in the heavenly beings, in the heavenly places. And now with its kingly motions it was pouring itself out towards me, and made haste in the hands of its givers that I might take and receive it. And me too my love urged forward to run for to meet it, to take it. And I stretched myself forth to receive it. With its beauty of color I decked me. And my mantle of sparkling colors I wrapped entirely all over me. Now remember, in Gnostic thought, one puts on the new humanity, the new man, the Christ. It's something that one takes onto oneself. So this and it's reflected in many Gnostic writings. Put on the anthropos, put on the perfect man, and so on. And so the mantle is being wrapped all over him, and he is becoming totally unified with that divine image. I clothed me therewith and ascended to the gate of greeting and homage. I bowed my head and did homage to the glory of him who had sent it. whose commands I now had accomplished, and who had too done what he'd promised. And there at the gate of his house sons I mingled myself with his princes. And this is a reference to what in Valentinianosis would be the eons, or the heavenly syzygies or beings that would be in Jewish mystic thought, the Elohim, the archangels, the beings that inhabit the 10th heaven with the throne of God, and so on. For he had received me with gladness, and I was with him in his sovereignty, in his Malkuth. For a patronage of $2 or more per lecture, you will receive PDF files of books featured in this series and passwords to Wisdom Seminars courses commensurate with your level of support. Please click on the Patreon link in my description just below the video to become a patron, helping to sponsor my new videos on the pre-Christian teachings of Yeshua. Thank you very much.